All right, guys, I'm going to be going through the fallout of the French and Indian War with you. You're going to just be taking this on the same set of notes that you took this on last class. And it's just a continuation. So, where we left off, the last slide you should have had was just us talking about the French and Indian War and the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Now, what you need to know about is what the Treaty of Paris actually did. And remember, there are two Treaty of Parises. So, you want to remember that this one's the 1763 version. So the biggest thing that's going to happen is that France is not going to have any more land in the colonies. And if you look at this map on the left-hand side, this is before the war. Everything that was in gold, that's all French territory. Afterwards, everything in purple is British. Everything in green is Spain. So Great Britain and Spain get all the land. Now, what this is going to immediately mean is that Native Americans are going to be treated worse. And the reason why they're going to be treated worse is because they had allied with the French in the French and Indian War. Remember, we have the whole idea of the French and Indian War is the French and Native Americans fighting against the British. So with the French now gone, the Native Americans' friends are now gone, and it's just going to be Great Britain and the Native Americans. And that is going to mean the Native Americans are not going to be treated well. Some of the ways that the Native Americans were not treated well was they did not get a say in the treaty at all, which they felt like they should have since they were an active participant. Even if you lose a war, usually you still get a seat at the treaty to come to a terms agreement. So they're not going to get a say in the treaty, and that's going to make them really upset. One of the ways that they showed that they were upset was there was a massive rebellion led by a Native American named Pontiac. And Pontiac's going to lead Native Americans against the British. And this is going to be in Detroit, or right around Detroit. You may know the name Pontiac because there was a car manufacturer that was called Pontiac for a while. It's gone now. 2008 recession took it. But this is one of the first examples that we have potentially of biological weapons being used. Now, what biological weapons are is it's where you use a disease as a weapon. So if you remember, Native Americans were super, super infectious to smallpox. This rebellion, this Pontiac rebellion, was going on in the winter. And so what American soldiers did is they took blankets, or what British soldiers did is they took blankets that people who had had smallpox were using, and they brought them to the Native Americans. And they were hoping that those blankets would still have smallpox on them and spread the smallpox amongst all the Native Americans. It did not work. That's the smallpox germ dies pretty fast on something like a blanket, but it was an attempt. Another thing to show conflict between British colonists and Native Americans is something called the Paxton Boys. The Paxton Boys were in the frontier, so they're kind of like the next generation of Bacon's Rebellion. And they were just going around killing Native Americans. Now, they were doing this in Pennsylvania, and the Quakers, who basically ran Pennsylvania, did not like this, and so they tried to punish them. And the Paxton Boys actually marched to Philadelphia, which was the capital of Pennsylvania, and they wanted to confront the Quakers. Now, remember, Quakers were against violence. So because of that, this would have been very, very awkward. Ben Franklin actually showed up and helped everyone make a peace agreement because he was just really good at that. But these are both examples of how Native Americans had issues with the colonists after the French and Indian War. Now, the British eventually got tired of constantly having to show up and put down these small rebellions between Native Americans and the colonists. They just didn't think it was a good use of their military. And so because of that, they're eventually going to make a rule, like a timeout period, for Native Americans and colonists to both just chill out. And this timeout period was called the Proclamation of 1763. So it was this big line. It's an imaginary line that followed the Appalachian Mountains. So even though the line didn't exist, you knew if you went over this mountain range, you were going into somebody else's territory. And anything west of this would now be Native American territory. Anything to the east of it, and if you look at the map, anything kind of in the light gold area, that's colonist territory. Anything kind of the orange, that's Native American territory. And this made the colonists super upset because one of the major reasons, if you remember, why was the French and Indian War fought? It was fought for this Ohio River Valley. Well, where can they not go now? The Ohio River Valley. So they feel like the British are way overstepping their boundary. And they also feel like, why did we just fight this war? We fought this war for this territory, and now you're telling us we can't use this. We don't like that. So this is going to lead to a lot of conflict between the native, or between the colonists now and Great Britain. And that's kind of the theme of these next two slides. The French and Indian War fallout is going to have a lot of negative ramifications between the British colonists and the British government. Proclamation of 1763 is one of those examples. Another example are going to be taxes. So wars cost a lot of money, and how governments make money is through taxation. The British almost went bankrupt with how expensive the French and Indian War was. And they felt like the colonists needed to pay for this war, since they felt like George Washington had kind of been a part of the start of it. Now, the controversial thing was, while George Washington kind of did do that, the British also had wanted to fight the French. And they felt like they weren't necessarily the only ones who wanted to fight in this war, and they shouldn't have to pay for this war. But Parliament, and this is a big word you need to know, Parliament is the British government, created imperialistic taxes. Imperialistic means you're doing something to another country. So if we tried to tax Mexico, for example, that would be called an imperialistic tax. So Parliament, the British government, tried to create this tax to make the colonists pay for the French and Indian War. There's two of them. First one is the Sugar Act. This placed a tax on all sugar. Sugar was well loved in the colonies. And the second was the Stamp Act. This is going to be the one that's going to be even a bigger deal. And it's not a tax on stamps. That's actually a common misconception. It was a tax on paper. What they did, though, is they took a stamp and they put the stamp on the paper once they taxed it. Now, this was a massive deal because everything was done through paper, kind of like how everything's done through a phone today. So newspapers, playing cards, everything that you can think of was really taxed. One thing you also want to think about is that the Stamp Act is going to greatly affect lawyers and rich people. Rich people read, and so because of that, they were taxed for that. And lawyers had lots of documentation. So this is really affecting the wealthy class, and that's going to have a massive effect because the wealthy are going to start to uprise, which is not how most revolutions go. Most revolutions, it's really the lower class that uprises, but in the American Revolution, it kind of starts more with an upper class. Overall, this upper class lawyer argument develops this idea that they are being taxed without representation. They feel like since the colonists don't have any vote in Parliament, they should not be taxed. And that is the big rally cry of the early American Revolution. Now, if you look at this picture right here, I just want you to look at the top, and it's called virtual representation. And virtual representation is this idea that the British government is representing the colonists because anything that the British government does, they're doing with the best interest of the colonists in mind. And a lot of the colonists did not agree with this. So another example of virtual representation would probably sometimes be if you have your mom or your dad sign a document for you. The reason why they're allowed to sign that document is most people think that their parents have their best interest in mind. But there are those examples sometimes of where parents, like especially if you think about like kids who get really famous, it does get really messy because all of a sudden the parent starts doing what's best for them, not actually what's best for the child. And that's what the colonists thought what was going on. They felt like Parliament was not doing what was best for the colonists, but actually what was best for the British government. And that's going to lead to a lot of tension. All right. And that is ultimately the fallout of the American revolutions, or of the French and Indian War, and the first steps to the American Revolution.